Yacht A, my relatives, hello, this is Mark Charles. It is Tuesday, July 25th, and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I wanted to have a conversation with you about some stuff going on in the political realm. I was asked a question a few weeks ago, or a few days ago, actually, last week, about Cornel West's campaign and what I thought of it. And then I was also have been following what's been going on with Ron DeSantis and his campaign and some of the laws that are being passed in Florida regarding especially the teaching of Black history, specifically the teaching regarding slavery. And so I want to talk about those things today. But before we begin, I want to do like I always do, which is acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., or as my Navajo people like to say, Washington. Um, and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the host of the land where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So let's get into it, right? There's a lot of things to discuss this morning and some things we want to kind of go over. And first, I want to share with you some of the articles I've been reading regarding Cornel West and his campaign. As you know, Cornel West announced a few months ago, and there's a few articles about his campaign here, and I'm going to put them into the chat if you'll give me just a second. Let me get them going in the chat here. Okay, there is one. This is from Politico, and this is why the Democrats fear Cornel West presents a unique challenge for Joe Biden. And then just so you know, this isn't only the rhetoric coming out of the left, but also the right. Here's an article coming out of Forbes that talks about the academic Cornel West announces his presidential bid. And this is coming out of the Forbes publication. And then there's one last article I want to give to you, and this is The Hill. So originally, Cornel West was running under the People's Party, and now I believe he is seeking the Green Party nomination. I don't know what's happening, if he's doing both the People's Party and the Green Party, or if he's doing something, only one or the other. But anyway, here's an article in The Hill talking about he's now running for the Green Party nomination. And right, so this is the big question, and you can, if you pay attention now, you're going to hear it's starting already, but it's going to continue throughout the campaign, which is the Democrats are going to cry and complain and say Cornel West is stealing our votes, and he's going to ruin our party, and he's going to put Donald Trump in office again, and oh, woe is us, bad person Cornel West, good person Joe Biden, blah 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 blah. Right? This is their whole game plan. Again, if you haven't heard me talk about this in the past, Republicans hate voters, right? They don't have a very popular platform. It's fairly white supremacist. They're very conservative. They're not growing their base. And so the Republicans are concerned when more people vote, right? So Republicans are doing a lot to keep people from voting. That's their biggest concern. The Democrats, they hate competition, right? So they court a much broader base, more people of color, more LGBTQ, more women, so on and so forth. But then when they nominate their white landowning man from the 1%, now they're afraid their base is going to wander. And so they want to make sure there's as few other options out there as possible. And so they're terrified of third party and independent candidates. This is just the way it works. It's the same anti-democratic sentiment. It's just Republicans hate voters and Democrats hate competition. This is how it works out. This is the way they keep their duopoly and good cop, bad cop, whatever it is they're playing. But that's their game plan. And so the Democrats are already, right, they're chomping at the bit and saying, yes, Cornel West is going to steal our votes and he is going to put Joe Biden back in office. Therefore, vote for Joe Biden, don't vote for Cornel West. That's their entire argument. You're going to hear it over and over and over again. Even from a lot of progressive Democrats, you're going to hear that, right? I had a lot of people who supported me and my work long before I even decided to run for president. they appreciated me, they donated me, they gave me platform on their stages, so on and so forth. But when I ran, then they said, "Oh no, it's too risky to vote for you, Mark. Voting for you is like voting for Trump. I can't do that." And so even some very progressive, very helpful, and very close friends of mine said, "Yeah, we can't support you. It's way too risky. I love your platform. I love your ideas, but I'm not willing to take that risk." Um, and so that happened with me, and I absolutely know that's going to happen with Cornel West, and the Democrats are going to ramp that up, especially if he gains any sort of momentum. They are going to demonize him very, very, very quickly and very, very, very loudly. The challenge is, right, and this is the challenge, is they're not wrong. You see, a majority of voters claim they're independent. And that's not just on the left, that's on the left and the right. And there's two primary third-party bases or parties. You have the Libertarian Party, which generally, very often, are very strongly leans to the right, and you have the Green Party, which also leans very much which leans on the other side very much to the left. You will rarely hear Democrats complain about the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, even though they're bigger, better organized, better funded, and have more voters than the Green Party does. But the Republicans kind of know their base, and they know how to keep their base happy. Again, the Democrats, on the other hand, they have a very broad base, and once they nominate their white landowning male from the 1%, their base begins to wander, and that makes the Green Party look attractive, and so they're very afraid about that. And so that's been the dynamic, right? And the Green Party has been blamed for giving Republicans the victory in numerous elections, even recent elections, including Donald Trump in 2016. But anyway, I already said all that. The challenge is a majority of voters identify themselves as Democrat or as independent. They lean to the left or they lean to the right. Maybe they look at the Libertarian or the Green Party, but really they're just saying, am I going to support what my party's putting forth this next year? I think that's one of the questions most of these people who identify themselves as independent are. They want to portray themselves as more thoughtful. They're not just the rah, 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 vote for whoever they nominate, or at least support whoever they nominate, even though once they close the curtain in the voting box, they're most likely going to vote for their party. But there's groups of people, large groups of people on both sides of the aisle who are open to being persuaded are influenced to vote outside of their two-party lines. Now, you're not going to win an election as a third-party candidate by merely courting the voters of a single party. You're not going to win an election that way. There's not enough Democrats and there's not enough Republicans where if you split the Democrats or you split the Republicans that you're going to have a majority, and so it's going to be very difficult if you lean to the left or to the right to say, yeah, this is who we are. Or if you're running as an independent and you're primarily getting votes from the left, it's almost impossible, or the right, it's almost impossible to win, because you're not going to win an election by splitting your party. And especially by not taking any of the votes from the other party. And so this is one of the challenges Cornel West is going to face in this election, is he is a very liberal candidate. He's taught at Harvard. He has a very liberal platform. He is a very much liberal, left-leaning candidate. Now, he does have some ties to the church. He does have some ties to the religious vote. But again, he largely leans to the left. And so it's going to be very difficult for him to win. Now, I would love it if Joe Biden faced a true primary challenger in this party, especially since they're going to start the voting for the primary in South Carolina. Right? I would love to see a person of color run against Joe Biden in the primary, especially in South Carolina. I hate the fact that Joe Biden, the Democrats, can say, look, we're this diverse group of people, or this diverse party, and we're going to start our primary not in Iowa this year, but in South Carolina. But, oh, by the way, we're only giving you an option of a white man to vote for. So black people can choose first, but essentially they only get to choose a white candidate. There's no other options. And that's not diversity at all. So I would love to see a strong Democratic challenger on the left against Joe Biden in the primary. And that's not going to happen, right? I don't see that happening. There's very few other candidates who are running who have a strong voice and a large platform and a large following. And Cornel West is probably the biggest third party candidate who's running, but he's running in the Green Party, which means he will face Joe Biden in the general election, but he will not face him in the primaries. And I think Joe Biden needs to be challenged in the primaries. And then after that, and then that's where he needs to be taken down, is in the primaries. So then you can run, if you're running on a liberal platform and you're left leaning and your base is left leaning, then you have to beat Joe Biden in the primary. So then you can go for the broader votes in the general election. That's my thoughts. And this is right. This is even one of the reasons why I ran as an independent, is because my critique is not just of the right. My critique is of both the left and the right. And I'm not appealing to either Democrats or Republicans, right? I'm not appealing to Democrats as someone from the right saying, hey, just convert to the right and vote for me. Nor am I appealing to people on the right and saying, hey, just convert to the left and vote for me. No, if you're really going to make any waves as an independent candidate, you have to be able to talk to people on both sides. And this is something I've been working to do myself for a long time. Now, I'm not running in 2024, but this is, I think, the challenge that Cornel West is going to face. Is I don't see him, especially now, appealing to voters from the right. I could be wrong. And if you're going to appeal to voters on the right, you need to say more than just you need to convert, right? You need to give up the right and move over to the left and just vote for me, right? That's not, you're just going to make them double down. You really have to talk to them and show them how, what you're fighting for is actually not that far from what they're advocating for. But Cornel West, again, he's very much entrenched on the left. So that's my concern about his campaign. Now, I'm watching it with great interest. I would love to see if he challenges Joe Biden in the primaries specifically, because that's where I truly believe Joe Biden needs to be beaten, is in the primaries, before he gets the nomination of his party. So that's my, I guess you would say, my advice to Cornel West, or my thoughts about him. But I'm intrigued by his campaign. I definitely think I would be more inclined to vote for him in a primary election than I would for Joe Biden. When it comes to a general election, I'm really not sure. I'm still waiting to see if he's going to try to build a broader coalition and a broader base here. So those are some of my thoughts about Cornel West. I welcome your feedback. I welcome your input. I'd love to hear other things that you are thinking about this, but those are some of the things I'm thinking. I see Shantina is on. Yate Shantina, thanks for joining today. Anyone else who's on? Don't see anyone else right now. Well, there's over a dozen people online, but don't see the comments on there. But I now want to get into the thing I want to talk about, which is Ron DeSantis. And if you've been following Ron DeSantis, he is running on the Republican ticket, or on the Republican, for the Republican Party. He is obviously running against Donald Trump. and he is a distant second, but probably the strongest competition that that Donald Trump is going to have in the Republican Party. And I shared with you an article from just a few days ago about this new law that came out of the Florida State Academic Standards, and especially regarding social studies in 2023. And it's this claim that the social study curriculum in Florida now needs to teach that slavery in some ways benefited Black people. Now, just so we know, we're not just screaming the arguments that the left is making, I'm going to actually share the link to where the standard is. And this is on the Florida State Academic Standards, their social studies for 2023 website. And I'm going to put that into the chat right there. And the section in question is SS.68 AA2 .2.3. And I want to bring that up on the screen right now if I can. Let me find this and bring it up. So this section examines the various duties and trades performed by enslaved peoples, example, agriculture work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmithing, transportation, so on and so forth. And one of the benchmark clarifications in this section is that instructions include how slaves developed skills which in some instances could be applied to their personal benefit. So this is the section down below that's creating all of the uproar. The instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. And so this is where Ron DeSantis has been getting questions about how are you teaching that slavery and enslavement was a benefit to Black people. Obviously, it was an inhumane, horrific institution that needs to be condemned at every level. And Ron DeSantis has, of course, been pushing back. Here's an article in People where he just a few days ago doubled down and stood behind the comments that he made, or behind the intent of the law. Now, in that article, it says DeSantis also tried to distance himself from the standards, saying, I didn't do it. I wasn't involved in the writing of that bill. And I'm reading from the article now, but the standards, which were approved by Florida's Board of Education last week, despite pleas from a statewide teachers union, came in response to the state's 2022 Stop Woke Act, a piece of legislation championed by DeSantis himself that stated that race must be taught in an objective manner that does not indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular point of view. And so, right, so he's basically behind this whole movement, and he's using legislation, especially his far right legislation, kind of as his campaign tools. And I'm going to share with you an article in the AP from a few months ago, looking at all of his bills that he's passed as governor, from abortion to guns to teaching of diversity and everything else, and how they're all these extreme right bills that a lot of them don't even hold up in court, but he's using them, he's passing them in Florida, again, so that he can campaign on that and campaign to the far right of his party. This is very much his plan. Now, the title of today's section, or of today's cup of coffee, is how Ron DeSantis, just like Richard Pratt did in 1892, Ron DeSantis is using white supremacist arguments to campaign to a traumatized white America. Now, before I can go into depth on this, I have to just go over briefly what I mean by a traumatized white America. If you haven't heard me speak about this before, I invite you to look up The Trauma of White America and my name, Mark Charles. I've written about this extensively. It's in chapter 11 of my book, Unselling Truths. But a very brief overview is right on the individual, personal level. We have what's known as a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. It affects you relationally, emotionally, Physically, it's kind of this all-encompassing condition that arises in a single individual in response to experiencing a horrifying event. And that's called a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's also what's known as a complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which doesn't come from a single event, it comes from a series of events. So if you get PTSD from being in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. If you get PTSD from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. Psychologists have observed that a complex PTSD is passed down generationally. They've observed the symptoms in the children and grandchildren of the people who experienced the trauma in the first place. Now, there's a third trauma called HTR, which is historical trauma. Historical trauma is not an individual diagnosis. It's actually how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a very broad community. It was first observed in Native communities after our experience of residential schools or boarding schools, as well as after removal or even massacres. You can see it in African American communities after enslavement, Jim Crow, segregation. You can see it in Japanese American communities after internment camps, or in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. And that helps us understand psychologically what's going on, especially within our communities of color, regarding discussions and conversations around race. But as we all know, the most disruptive demographic in race dialogue is not communities of color, it's white communities. And this is where the research of Rachel McNair comes in incredibly helpful. She was looking at what she calls the psychology of killing. Basically, she examined what happens when society gives you the right to take a life. You're in a certain field in the medical position, you're a drone operator in the military, you're a soldier, you're a police officer, you're even a good guy at the mall with a gun, right? And society gives you the right to take a life. Her question is, what does that do to you psychologically? She looked at a very broad study of Vietnam veterans. She looked at this quote by Socrates that said the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer. And she concluded that it causes what she described as a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. PITS. Has all the symptoms of a PTSD, except PTSD afflicts the victims of the horrifying event, and PITS afflicts the perpetrators, the person who caused it. Now, in chapter 11 of my book, Unselling Truths, I use her research to hypothesize that if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level that we call historical trauma that affects our communities of color, might not PITS also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which is what I have observed is called what I have observed and call the trauma of white America. Because you cannot participate in, enact hundreds of years of dehumanizing, genocidal policies and wars and massacres and actions without traumatizing yourself, right? You can't build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourself. And so I treat my white audiences, wherever I speak, as another group of traumatized people. The first symptom of trauma is shock and denial, right? Once you understand this makes perfect sense. When you see the uproar from both the left and the right about any discussion, whether it's regarding guns or critical race theory or immigration, right? The right gets triggered, starts screaming. They trigger the left. They start screaming back. You have this massive chaos of screaming white people from both the left and the right, right? Both not even control of their own faculty, just screaming at each other. This is what happens. You bring up any of these topics and you get groups of white people just screaming at each other. You understand that they're in a state of shock and denial. Yeah, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And this is absolutely what Ron DeSantis is campaigning to. He is campaigning to a traumatized white America where he triggers them and then presents his solution, which is he's going to maintain the status quo of American exceptionalism and implicit white supremacy, and everything's going to be okay. This is what he does over and over and over and over again, right? And how do I know this? Well, he makes it very clear in this law that teaches that enslavement was a benefit to black people, right? And it gave them skills that they could use for their personal benefit. See, if you understand history, this is not a new ploy, right? This is not something new that's going on. In 1890, we had one of the bloodiest massacres in our nation's history with the massacre at Wounded Knee, right? And our nation, believe it or not, was actually beginning to tire after a century and a half of genocide against Native peoples. And it was beginning to tire of this ethnic cleansing, explicit policy of just wiping out Native Americans. But they still wanted our land. They still wanted us out of the way. And so in 1892, Richard Pratt, speaking at a conference, and this is at, I'm going to share this with you. He was speaking at the National Conference of Charities and Correction. And he proposed his idea of killing the Indian and saving the man. And he builds an argument for forcibly assimilating Native peoples, indigenous peoples, to Western European American language and culture, ridding us of our savage ways and assimilating us into Western European American culture. I'm going to share a few links with you here because some of the things he does in this, and the first is, this is a resource from Dickinson College, and it's on the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center. So this college is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is right near the Carlisle Indian School, which was a horrific place, one of the first boarding schools, and there's actually, a lot of horrible history that took place there. And now I'm going to share with you a link to the speech that he gave at this conference. I'm going to put this into the chat right now. So when we look at that, now let me bring up this on the screen. So this is the speech that he gave, and I want to just walk you through some of these things that he said. So first of all, let's go back to the first quote where he said, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that the high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So that's his proposal. Let's forcibly assimilate Native Americans to Western European culture using our Indian boarding schools as a way to assimilate them to our way of life. Now, he goes on in his argument, and he immediately begins to reference enslavement. And he says, "Inscrutable are the ways of Providence. Horrible as were the experiences of its introduction and of slavery itself, there was concealed in them the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race. 7 million of blacks from cannibalism in darkest Africa to citizenship in free and enlightened America. Not full, not complete citizenship, but possible, probable citizenship, and on the highway and near to it." He goes on and says, "There is a great lesson in this. The schools did not make them citizens. The schools did not teach them the language, nor make them industrious and self-supporting. Denied the right of schools, they became English-speaking and industrious through the influences of association. Scattered here and there under the care and authority of individuals from the higher race, they learned self-support and something of citizenship, and so reached their present place. Again, this is 1892, almost 30 years after the institution of chattel slavery was abolished. It says, no other influence or force could have so speedily accomplished such a result. Left in Africa, surrounded by their fellow African savages, our 7 million of industrious black fellow citizens would still be savages. Transferred into these surroundings and experiences, behold the result. They became English-speaking and civilized. Because forced into association with English-speaking civilized people, they became healthy and multiplied because they were property and industrious, and because industry, which brings contentment and health, was a necessary quality to increase their value. Right? This is the crap that Richard Pratt was peddling in 1892. If you go back, right, there was trauma going on in white America. If you look at his speech, after he talks about killing the Union to save man, he goes into how Jefferson and Washington had this debate, and Washington was about let's assimilate them, and Jefferson was about let's kill them. And he said, we've always used Jefferson's plan, and now, right, at no point in the history of the country or in no case has Washington's plan been honestly tried. At every period, we have blindly and remorselessly followed Jefferson. We have brought the Indians into moving. We have harassed them into moving. We have fought them into moving. We have imprisoned them upon reservations, and then most carefully guarded them and hindered their intercourse in any way, shape, or manner with us and our best civilization. A century of dishonor has been written. And so he's campaigning to the trauma of white America that is horrified by what they've done for 150 years to Native peoples. And he's saying, now let's actually let them benefit from us by letting them associate with us, assimilating to our ways. In the book I wrote with Simchan Ra on Southern Truth, in chapter 8, we actually address this speech by Richard Pratt. And this is what we concluded after laying out all of his quotes. To the white supremacist mind, the most benevolent and charitable gift that can be given to the broader subhuman population is the privilege of association with and assimilation to the dominant culture. This implicit bias of white supremacy can be seen even in the language that is used today. Many authors, professors, pastors, and social justice leaders and organizations, both Christian and secular, who are considered to be on the forefront of the racial dialogue, frequently use the term white privilege. However, the word privilege suggests that the inequality that favors white people is actually a blessing which they must learn to share. The term white privilege perpetuates an implicit bias. Whiteness is neither a privilege nor a blessing to be shared. It is a diseased social construct that needs to be confronted. And this is what Ron DeSantis is campaigning on, right? This is what he's telling the traumatized white people in Florida. Enslavement was a blessing to black people. It benefited them. It gave them tools they could use to become assimilated and civilized and leave their savage ways, because whiteness in DeSantis's mind is the primary destination. The guy is a mess, right? The guy's a wreck, creating havoc. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he needs to do to win support. He knows, he understands. Maybe he doesn't have the language of the traumatized white America, but he absolutely knows if he campaigns this way and presents his solution this way through his white supremacist, American exceptionalist mindset, that he's going to get supporters. Ron DeSantis is a joke. right? He's a joke. He is a deeply traumatized white American who is clinging to the myth of his own exceptionalism to justify the absolutely inhumane actions that he and his people enacted upon African and Native peoples to build this country. And he wants to be its leader, not because he wants to fix these problems, but because he wants to promise to keep them buried. Ron DeSantis and the entire Republican Party in this line of thinking is an absolute joke. And don't think I'm saying Democrats are any better whatsoever, right? Remember my TEDx talk. Ruth Bader Ginsburg absolutely uses the same savage language used by John Marshall in 1823 to justify land titles and the doctrine of discovery. This is a national problem that we have. And politicians from both sides of the aisle are going to use it. And that's one of the challenges I see with Cornel West running primarily to the left. Because the left doesn't have the answer, just like the right doesn't have the answer. Yes, you will get more support initially if you demonize one side and lift up the other. But both sides need to be critiqued, and we need a new way forward, not just the left and not just the right. We need a new way forward, and I don't see Cornel West offering that yet. Maybe he will. I'm open to seeing what he proposes. But I know I'm actually very concerned because he taught at Harvard, right? And Harvard is one of the most colonized places that muffles the voice of any sort of foundational level dissent of any institution I'm aware of. And so, yeah, I think he's learned how to speak that language in a way that sounds liberal, but still holds up the base and the foundations of this decrepit system that we built for 250 years. So those are my thoughts. Those are the things that I'm trying to think about, and I'm very interested to see what happens. I hope you find these things helpful. And I hope, again, I want to continue to promote my book on selling truths. If you have not read it yet, you can buy signed copies of it on my website. If you have read it, I can encourage you to start a book study group where you can study it. And if you buy a pack of 10 signed books from my website, I will give you and your book study a 45-minute virtual Q&A with me sometime in the next year, scheduled at your convenience, to go in depth on these questions and to talk about the content of the book and ask questions about it. I also want to invite you to join me on Patreon. If you join me on Patreon, this is where I would go to take the conversation even deeper. On Thursday of this coming week, in 2 days, I'm going to be speaking with a good friend of mine. He's Aboriginal. His name is Raymond Miniacon. He's Aboriginal from Australia. I've known him for about 20 years now, and he is doing some incredible work among the Indigenous people in Australia to lift up their voice and to fight for their own humanity within their colonial system there. And he's going to be my guest. We're doing that cup of coffee in the evening because he's in Australia, which is a much different, further, like almost 12-hour different in the time zone. So we're doing it 8 o'clock in the evening Eastern time, and then we'll be following that up with a Q&A on Patreon a few, 10 minutes later after that second cup of coffee finishes. You need to be signed up for the Ask Questions tier of my Patreon to join that Q&A. But anyway, I'm so excited to talk to my relatives. Thank you for joining me today. I hope your cup of coffee is as good as mine is, and I hope these thoughts are helpful. Walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. a cat and a cone.